Hello chaps, Paul Curran here. I hope you're both well. A good time was had by all. There's a phrase that we're all familiar with. We may not use it ourselves, but we've certainly heard it. And if I were asked to attribute it to an occasion, I would probably suggest the Queen's coronation, or an advert from the 50s, something like that. Mr. Kipling's exceedingly good cakes. But not so. It is in fact the title of a novel written by a young authoress and poet in 1937. Her name was Florence Margaret Smith. She came to be known and loved for her work by the name of Stevie Smith. I'm about to read her most well-known poem, Not Waving But Drowning, and it's worth noting that in that poem, which tells of a man mistakenly thought to be waving out in this body of water, in fact, as he lies dying on the shore, he explains he was drowning. And interestingly, alongside the poem, when it was first published in 1957, Stevie Smith drew an image of a young girl appearing from the water, her hair wet against her face, and bearing what's been described as a mysterious smile. It's quite a poignant image when one considers that Stevie Smith struggled with depression and even admitted to having suicidal tendencies, which reviewers have suggested might have been a result of the abandonment of her at a young age, I think at the age of 4, by her father. Then later on her mother was ill and she moved from Palmer's Green in London to Broadstairs in Kent to be with her Aunt Maud, whom she referred to as the Lion Aunt. Also, reviewers of her work, her poems, have spoken of the quality that she has of being concise and writing in a way that suggests she may never even have read poetry or studied it, such is the quality she has of communicating in an unadorned way, as best represented by this poem. Clive James, the Australian man of letters, presenter, poet, he has written of Not Waving But Drowning, the poems, if they were pills to cure melancholy, did not work for Smith. The best of them, however, worked like charms for everyone else. Not waving, but drowning. Nobody heard him, the dead man, but still he lay moaning. I was much further out than you thought, and not waving, but drowning. Poor chap. He always loved larking, and now he's dead. It must have been too cold for him. His heart gave way, they said. Oh, no, 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 no. It was too cold always. Still the dead one lay moaning. I was much too far out all my life, and not waving, but drowning. When I first thought to read Not Waving But Drowning by Stevie Smith, I turned to an old anthology of mine, and the poem wasn't to be found there. I did, however, come across a poem which I'd found amusing some years ago, and which amuses still, written by the American poet Skip Spence. You can see that his name also begins with double S. That's the tenuous link this week. Skip Spence, Alexander Skip Spence, who died in 1999 at the young age of 52, 53, was in fact a shining light of the psychedelic rock movement in America in the mid-late 60s. He worked with Jefferson Airplane. He was in a band called Moby Grape, He later released a solo album, or OAR, and he's been praised since his death as really being a principal player in that movement, and he's certainly had much musical ability. I've managed to find, in fact, a medley of him performing two songs, and the second one of which is Motorcycle Irene. This is how it goes. Motorcycle Irene. There she sits a-smoking, reefer in her mouth, her hair hanging northward as she travels south. Dirty on her Harley, but her nails are clean. Superpowered, deflowered, over 18, Irene. I've seen her in the Bear, where her tattoos and her chains wrap around her body, where written are the names of prisons she's been in, and lovers she has seen. Curve winding, bumping, grinding, Motorcycle Irene. Ground round like hamburger, laying in a splat. 'Tis Irene, her sheen I seen, in pieces crumbled flat. Her feet were in the bushes, her toes were in a hat. Stark raving, unshaven, Motorcycle Irene. The hunchback, the cripple, the horseman and the fool. Prayer books and candles, and carpets, cloaks and jewels. Knowing all the answers, breaking all the rules. With stark, naked, unsacred, Motorcycle Irene. The anthology which I alluded to earlier on, wherein I was unable to find Not Waving But Drowning by Stevie Smith, and did happen upon Motorcycle Irene by Skip Spence, is called Touched with Fire, which I recognised as a phrase from a wonderful poem by Stephen Spender. The double S link continues. Now, Stephen Spender, who lived from 1909 to 1995, was a CBE no less, lived an extraordinarily privileged existence in terms of the company that he kept. He was a very good friend, close friend of W.H. Auden, but he knew also Cecil Day-Lewis, Yeats, Ginsberg he met, David Jones, author of In Parenthesis, and the painter, Dylan Thomas, and also he had a close association with Virginia Woolf. So some phone book. He lived as well in the major cities at times of great change and social unrest. He was in Berlin in 1933, and he was very socially aware, particularly, I think, concerned with the class distinctions, the class struggle, the class inequality within Britain, and he was a member of the British Communist Party. Also, as well as his work, he was known for his very progressive attitude towards relationships. He spoke openly of relationships with men early in his life. He was married unsuccessfully after that. Then later his poems moved away from the more overtly homosexual. There's one poem, I forget the title of it, but the last line was amended from something like I'll still have the boy, the railway platform and the revolution, to I'll still have the affair, the railway station and the revolution. And then he married for a second time. He married Natasha, and they had a daughter, Lizzie, who went on to marry Barry Humphries. We heard a moment ago the words of Clive James, Barry Humphries, Clive James, Germaine Greer, part of that fiery intellectual Antipodean wave that came across in the 60s. This poem by Stephen Spender is, on first reading, it's a poem that deals in an autobiographical sense with him, his relationship with others, and his relationship with his parents. Of course, it may also allude on a larger scale to the trouble of class distinctions within the country. He says at one point that he was kept away from certain types, which immediately suggests that his foot was in that camp, and it wasn't where these other boys he mentions belonged. Anyway, this is My Parents by Stephen Spender. My parents kept me from children who were rough, and who threw words like stones, and who wore torn clothes. Their thighs showed through rags. They ran in the street and climbed cliffs and stripped by the country streams. I feared more than tigers their muscles like iron, and their jerking hands, and their knees tight on my arms. I feared the salt coarse pointing of those boys who copied my lisp behind me on the road. They were lithe, they sprang out behind hedges like dogs to bark at our world. They threw mud, and I looked another way, pretending to smile. I longed to forgive them, yet they never smiled. So there we are. We have Stevie Smith, Skip Spence, Stephen Spender. Hopefully now you'll be able to hear Skip Spence and his wonderful Motorcycle Irene.